socialism is taken as a great ideal and not contested much in India. Prime Minister Nehru was very much committed. But then we entered a huge crisis and we changed our policies from 1991. So here LPG, liberalization, privatization and globalization introduced. This is what happened in the case of India. But in the case of USSR, it collapsed by 1991, and China also underwent many problems till it took to market reforms in 1979. But if you go through some of the writings of some people, particularly Rajagopalachari, he seemed to have understood what was the problem with socialism even at that time, say by 1959 or 60. In fact, he started a new party suggesting pro-market ideology, criticizing socialism. Okay. And many of the things he said are very insightful. Okay. So let us review how socialism was functioning by 1960s. Okay. And how maybe correction could have taken place or should have taken place by that time. Okay, how did all this start? Let us take Nehru. Nehru was one very important person responsible for socialism in India. Nehru, after his education at Harrow and Cambridge, he returned to India in 1912. And there he attended lectures by Bertrand Russell and James Keynes. So he was not a dogmatic Marxist. He was a well-read person. He understood, he read Marxism as well as alternative economic ideologies, including that of Keynes. But then he very clearly favored socialism. He was very critical of capitalism. In his book, Discovery of India, this is what Nehru wrote. He says, economic change will have to be in the direction of democratically planned collectivism. Democracy, one. Planning, one. And he is using the word collectivism. Collectivism means doing things together. Okay. It can be cooperative farming. It can be workers managing the organization. This collectivism. A democratic collectivism need not mean an abolition of private property, but it will mean the public ownership of the basic and major industries. In India, especially, it will be necessary to have, in addition to big industries, cooperatively controlled small and village industries. Such a system of democratic collectivism will need careful and continuous planning and adaptation of the changing needs of the people. So, what Nehru thought of was so collective enterprises or cooperatives or simply state-owned. So Nehru believed this is the solution to India's problems and not capitalism. Okay. So he was not for the abolition of private property. That would be impossible. But he thought primarily this was the way to go about. But then what are the problems that this kind of thinking gave rise to? The problem is, in any joint ownership, there is no incentive. So efficiency won't be there. Okay. And if state-owned enterprises depends upon the political sector. And if the political sector becomes corrupt and inefficient, then the state-owned public sector also will become corrupt and inefficient. So, in the kind of socialism that Nehru imagined, there was no incentive to private initiative, private ownership. So they won't contribute much to the wealth generation, and this is what historically proved. So it is not that he was thinking it as some kind of an intermediate arrangement, or they should be thrust to private initiative. Private sector should be encouraged, until then public sector. Nehru was not thinking like that. Nehru was thinking that the main thing should be under public sector because he was against um, income concentration. Income concentration. So socialism in India was thought in terms of how to prevent income concentration. So how to not to contribute to inequalities. How not to contribute inequalities. So socialism was conceived in terms of reduction of inequalities. So uh, private initiative or accumulation of private property would contribute to inequalities. This is what they thought. Okay. So Nehru went for Nehru went for public sector. Okay, huge public sector, and then public sector means government controlled. So officers would manage. Officers manage. And then this whole thing is centralized and planned and giving preference to industry. So he was following Soviet kind, centralized, planned and industrialized. Okay, this was supposed to be done and this is being done, unlike in USSR, in a democratic context. This is the difference. But in USSR or in India, there are certain common problems. That is, the government is managing, and when the government is not able to manage, the public sector suffers. When the government becomes corrupt, public sector suffers. So, this is the logic in public sector management. This is the logic of socialism. Okay, and such inefficiency seemed to have crept in by 60s, and definitely after that things got even worse. Okay, so Rajagopalachari is one person who understood that there is a serious problem with this. Rajagopalachari was the first Governor General, was quite close to, was a freedom fighter, quite close to power centers, to Gandhi and Nehru. And he worked as Madras Chief Minister till 1954 and resigned. He retired from politics from 1954. Okay. He formed Swatantra Party in 1959. He was never enamored by the concept of socialism. Okay. So he became one of the earliest critics of Nehru's socialism. And if you see what he has, if you read what he said, we will know that many inefficient things took place by then. So this is what he had to say. Okay. Private enterprise should be fostered. Private enterprise should be fostered by every means available and not treated as a dangerous enemy. It was treated as a dangerous enemy because they thought that it would contribute to income inequalities. Industrial enterprise would then spread at various levels in the countryside and reduce the tensions that attach to centralized industrialism. So Rajaji was thinking private sector participation would lead to decentralized production. Market meant decentralization. Okay. And the role of the government should be that of a catalyst in stimulating economic development. While individual initiative and enterprise are given the fullest play. And economic development takes place faster when diversity is permitted and fullest use is made of local, physical, and social conditions by those who knew them. And who knew those who were going by decentralized system. And Rajaji thinks that it is market that pays attention to local conditions. And one of the most neglected aspects of planning in this country is gearing up of the administrative machinery and the simplification of procedures. So procedures were very complex. So what was written in 1959 seemed to be what finally got to be written in 1990s. So Rajaji was 30 years ahead of his times, minimum 30 years. And next he says, he was forming a new party, that is Swatantra Party. And it issued a manifesto in 1959. The Swatantra Party stands for minimum government and minimum state interference, and for minimum expenditure in administration and minimum taxation, minimum interference in the private and professional affairs of citizens, and for minimum regulation in industry and trade. This minimum thing was taken as a freedom. Okay, economic freedom was seen as minimum interference, whereas some people thought economic inequalities would reduce that freedom. And he said responsibility is reduced if the individual disappears and multiple ownership and delegated authority takes over the management, the way public sector is managed. So that reduces the responsibility. And then he said, egalitarian distribution of distress and poverty is not what anybody wants. Socialism should distribute wealth and not poverty. And next he says, why this arrangement is not proper. He says, it is not good for the nation to allow the states which, be it remembered, must always be in the grip of some political party with its own motives and interests to run all the beneficent activities of the nation as its exclusive monopoly. Very important. Because what is a state control? It simply means ruling party control. And the ruling party can use the public sector for a variety of purposes. So how will it be efficient? So Rajaji is pointing out why public sector has an inherent problem. And Swatantra Party believes that the social justice and welfare can be reached more certainly and properly in other ways than through the techniques of so-called socialism, with all its accomplishments of injustice, expropriation, and repudiation of obligations. So he is saying socialism is injustice, expropriation, and repudiation of obligations. Why is it a repudiation of obligation? Because if you don't perform your duty, you are not being punished because you are not responsible for anything. You are just working on a salary. You, if not this job, you do something else. So, and so he's saying Swathantra Party would restrict state enterprise to heavy industries to supplement private enterprise in that field. National services such as the railways and the starting of pioneer industries where private initiative is lacking. So, private initiative will be encouraged. When it is not there, then public sector. It means private sector will not be blocked or discouraged because it leads to inequalities. Public sector will be there when private sector is not doing or inappropriate. So, reduction of inequalities may be a target, but reduction of inequalities through control over production is not desirable. Okay, how we can reduce inequalities without controlling production, without pulling down people from acquiring wealth is a different issue. But Rajaji is critical of controlling the production process on the ground that it shouldn't lead to, it might lead some people to acquire more wealth. And the party wants taxation to be kept at a level which is not so high that exacting as to prevent capital formation and investment by Indians. Taxation at that time was very high and it got to be hugely reduced during liberalization time. Okay. And then Rajaji says, by that time, license permit Raj was created where honest people fear. So he wrote an essay titled The India I Want in 1961. Okay, and what he wrote, I want an India clear of the atmosphere of fear in which it is now enveloped, where honest men engaged in the difficult task of production or trade can carry on their occupations without fear of ruin at the hands of officials, ministers, and the party bosses. Definitely, he was proposing an alternative to what was going on at that time. So, honest people feared at the time. I want an India where talent and energy can find scope for play without having to cringe and obtain special individual permission from officials and ministers, and where their efforts will be judged by the open market in India and abroad. So that shows that talent was being crippled. And I want the corruption of this permit license Raj to go. I want real equal opportunities for all and no private monopolies created by the permit license Raj. This is important. Usually it is thought if you let things to market will create monopolies. But Rajaji was saying, state was creating monopolies. Why? Because state through this license permit Raj favors some and doesn't favor others. So it is encouraging. Okay. So the idea that if the state has a state controls, then it is free from business pressures is not true. Big business can pressurize to get licenses and to earn money and give the money for politics. I want the money power of big businesses to be isolated from politics. So this is a case of how socialism produced big business. How did socialism produce big business? By eliminating the market, by eliminating the competition, by introducing permit license Raj. So what Nehru thought he would avoid through socialism, that monopolies, corruption, and big money playing part in politics, he was not able to. Rajaji was saying that his socialism only created these problems. So I found this very insightful way of looking at Nehru's socialism. And if that was the case by 60s, then after that, political sector became even more inefficient and corrupt. So that would affect public sector. So public sector must have become much worse. So we can't assume that socialism is a solution to the problems. Socialism may block wealth creation because it doesn't promote individual initiative. It doesn't give incentives to work. So Rajaji's criticism shows that by 1960s, these dysfunctional things developed. So what is the way out? So encourage private initiative. Okay, let people earn money. Let them provide jobs to others. Let others also earn. But so let this lead to tax money. So how should this tax money be used? Okay. Or how to help the disadvantaged. So how to help the disadvantaged to earn should be the way to think. Okay, should be the way to think rather than how to block people from earning on the ground that it leads to inequalities. Okay, so these things call for reflection.